There's something different about driving at night. The roads are quieter, the world feels emptier, and the darkness beyond your headlights seems endless. Most of us have driven down a lonely stretch of highway long after midnight, when the rest of the world is asleep, and in those moments, the mind starts to wander. Shapes in the distance look strange, headlights behind you seem to follow too closely, and every shadow beyond the roadside feels like it's hiding something. Tonight, we're going to travel into that unsettling space, the empty highways, the forgotten back roads, and the moments that start like any ordinary late-night drive, but turn into something much darker. Settle in. Dim the lights. And listen closely. These are true scary late-night driving stories told slowly, calmly, and just real enough to keep you glancing in your rear-view mirror. Our first story takes us down a long, desolate highway in the middle of nowhere, where one driver's late-night detour leads to an encounter they'll never forget. Story 1: The Road to Ashwood Hollow. There's something about driving late at night that feels different from any other time. The world becomes quieter, lonelier. The empty highways stretch on endlessly, bathed only in the pale glow of your headlights, and the familiar becomes strange in the dark. It's in those quiet, in-between hours that the road holds its secrets, and sometimes, those secrets find you. This is one of those late-night driving scary stories, and it still haunts me every time I think about it. I've been a long-haul driver for nearly a decade now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Drunken drivers weaving across lanes, animals darting out of nowhere, even people trying to flag me down in the middle of nowhere. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night on Route 19. It was late autumn, a little after midnight, and I was hauling a load of hardware supplies from Denver to a small town called Ashwood Hollow. It's one of those forgotten places most people never hear about, just a scattering of homes tucked deep in the Colorado woods. The drive usually takes about 7 hours, but I had left later than planned, and now I was the only vehicle on the road. The night was unusually dark. Heavy clouds had rolled in, blotting out the stars and swallowing the moon. The beams of my headlights barely seemed to cut through the murky blackness ahead. The road was a narrow 2-lane highway, snaking through miles of forest, with no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just trees pressing in on both sides. I had the radio on low, playing some late-night talk show, just to fill the silence. My coffee was cold, and my eyes burned from staring into the darkness for hours. The monotony of the drive was almost hypnotic. I remember thinking how easy it would be to just let my mind drift, to let the truck guide itself down that lonely road. And that's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a deer on the shoulder, something pale just barely illuminated at the edge of my headlights. But as I drew closer, my stomach tightened. It wasn't a deer. It was a woman, standing just inches from the road, facing the trees. I slowed down instinctively, leaning forward over the steering wheel. She was barefoot, wearing a thin white dress that clung to her as if it had gotten wet. Her long hair was hanging down over her face, and she wasn't moving. Not even a twitch. Just standing there, motionless, staring into the woods. I rolled past her slowly, trying to get a better look without stopping. My first thought was that she might be injured, or in shock. Maybe she'd been in an accident. But there were no cars on the roadside, no skid marks, no signs of a crash, nothing. I glanced at my mirrors as I drove by, expecting to see her still standing there. But she was gone. Not walking. Not turning. Just gone. I scanned the shoulder frantically, even braked for a moment, but the side of the road was empty. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I wasn't tired enough to hallucinate. I knew I'd seen someone there. And yet, there was no trace of her. I thought about turning around. Maybe I should have. But something deep in my gut told me not to. The kind of instinct that doesn't use words, just a cold, sharp no. So I shifted gears, pressed on the gas, and tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and that patch of road. For a few miles, nothing happened. The forest pressed closer around me. The night grew heavier, and the hum of the engine was the only sound. I was starting to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light, maybe fog, or a tree trunk that looked like a person. And then the radio cut out. The talk show dissolved into static so suddenly it made me flinch. I reached over and fiddled with the dial, but it was useless, just an ocean of white noise, no matter the station. That's not unusual in the mountains, I told myself. Dead zones happen. Still, something about the silence after the static felt wrong. That's when I noticed the temperature in the cab had dropped. Not gradually, but like someone had opened a freezer. My breath was fogging in front of me, and goosebumps crawled up my arms. I reached for the climate controls, but they were already set to warm. The heater was blowing. And yet, the air felt frigid, heavy, unnatural. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, something sour and wet, like rotting leaves after rain. But it grew stronger, seeping into the truck, clinging to the back of my throat. It reminded me of decay. Of earth disturbed after too long. I checked the vents, the cab, even the cargo in the back. Nothing explained it. The road curved sharply ahead, and I slowed down, leaning into the bend. The forest loomed closer, and that's when I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Something was running alongside the truck. I snapped my head toward the passenger side window, and for a second, just a second, I saw a shape pacing me through the trees. It was low to the ground, too big to be a deer, too fast to be a person. And the way it moved, it wasn't right. Its limbs were jerky and uneven, as though it was crawling and lurching at the same time. I hit the gas. The truck roared forward, and the shape vanished back into the shadows. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, and I realized I was breathing hard. My rational brain was clawing for explanations. A bear. A trick of the headlights. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But underneath all that reasoning was a single, cold truth I couldn't shake. Something was out there. I drove faster. Trees blurred by, the road a tunnel of blackness ahead. I just wanted to reach Ashwood Hollow, to see a light, a sign, anything that meant I was close to people again. But the road kept stretching on. Longer than it should have. Much longer. I glanced at the GPS on my dash. According to it, I should have hit a small town about 15 minutes ago. But the map was frozen. The little arrow marking my location wasn't moving. I tapped the screen, nothing. Restarted the device, it wouldn't respond. That's when the headlights flickered. Just once, like a blink. Then again. And then they went out completely. Suddenly, the world vanished into darkness. No road. No trees. Just black. I slammed the brakes, terrified of veering off into a ditch, but the truck kept rolling forward, slower now, coasting. And then, the lights snapped back on. I screamed. There, standing directly in the middle of the road, was the woman I had seen earlier. Same white dress. Same hair hanging down over her face. Only now she was facing me. Her head was tilted at a strange angle, too far to one side, as if her neck couldn't support it. Her arms hung limply at her sides. I swerved violently, tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck fishtailed, the trailer pulling hard, and for a second I thought I was going to roll it. But I managed to correct and come to a stop just inches from the ditch. My heart was slamming against my ribs. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep hold of the wheel. I looked back at the road. She was gone again. No footprints. No rustle of movement. Just the empty, endless stretch of highway. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, engine idling, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I knew this wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't some hallucination. I knew what I saw. And then, something knocked on my passenger side door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My blood turned to ice. Every nerve in my body screamed not to look. But I couldn't help myself. I turned my head, inch by inch, toward the window. Nothing. The glass was empty. The forest beyond it was silent and still. Then I heard it again. Knock. 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 This time, it was on the driver's side. I couldn't see anything. Not a shadow, not a face. Just the hollow sound of knuckles on metal. As if someone or something was circling my truck, testing the doors, waiting for me to react. And then it stopped. Silence. No sound but the wind in the trees and the low rumble of the idling engine. I sat there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. But eventually, I forced myself to shift back into gear and start driving. I didn't care how fast I was going. I just needed to leave. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. The smell faded. The air warmed. The static on the radio cleared. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the forest gave way to streetlights and houses. I had reached Ashwood Hollow. I pulled into a gas station and parked, my legs still trembling as I climbed out of the cab. The night was quiet, normal, almost peaceful. I went inside, bought a cup of coffee, and asked the clerk if anything strange had happened on Route 19 recently. He gave me a long, heavy look. "You must have seen her," he said. I froze. "Who?" "The woman on the road," he said quietly. "You're not the first driver who's come in here shaking like a leaf. Folks say she was killed out there about 10 years ago. Car broke down late one night. Somebody hit her and never stopped. They found her body a week later, but her head," he trailed off, shaking his head. "They say her neck was broken clean through." I felt sick. "She's been seen ever since," he continued. Always on nights like this. Cold. Dark. Alone. I thanked him, though I'm not sure why, and stumbled back to my truck. My hands still trembled as I gripped the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to believe he was just messing with me, spinning a ghost story for a gullible outsider. But deep down, I knew better. I'd seen her. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night when the radio cuts out and the air turns cold, I can't help but glance at the side of the road, half expecting to see her standing there again, watching the trees. That night on Route 19 changed the way I see the road forever. Now, whenever I drive those empty highways in the dead of night, I keep my eyes on the shoulder, and I never, ever stop for anyone. Because out there, in the darkness beyond your headlights, some things are waiting. And some roads remember. That one sent a chill through you. This next story might keep you up tonight. It begins like so many of our drives do, a calm, lonely road under the stars, until a strange figure appears by the roadside. What follows is a haunting that defies explanation. Story 2, Mile Marker 313. This is one of those late-night driving scary stories that I still think about whenever I pass mile marker 313. I used to do delivery runs between Amarillo, Texas, and Flagstaff, Arizona. Long, quiet stretches of highway through deserts and plains, hundreds of miles with barely a bend in the road. Most nights were uneventful, just me, the hum of the engine, and a sky full of stars. But one night about 4 years ago, something happened on that road that I still can't explain. It was a little past 2 a.m., one of those clear, cold nights where the air feels sharper than usual. I was ahead of schedule, cruising along Route 40 with another 2 hours before my next stop. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, flat and empty, the horizon swallowed by darkness. I remember the moon was bright that night, not full, but bright enough to paint the sand in shades of silver. My high beams cut a long cone through the empty road, and the only sound was the steady thrum of the tires against the asphalt. It was the kind of night that lulls you into a trance if you're not careful. I'd been driving for hours without seeing another soul, no cars, no trucks, no signs of life. It felt like I was the last person left on Earth. And then I passed mile marker 313. There was nothing unusual about it. Just a battered green sign at the side of the road, half lit by my headlights. But the moment I passed it, the engine made a soft, stuttering sound like it had hiccuped and then kept going. I frowned, checked the gauges. Everything looked fine. I chalked it up to nothing and kept driving. 5 minutes later, I saw someone on the side of the road. A man. He was standing a few feet off the shoulder, facing the highway. My lights swept over him as I approached. He was wearing jeans, a plaid shirt, and a baseball cap. Nothing remarkable about him, except for the fact that he was completely still. Not waving, not walking, not signaling for help. Just standing there, arms hanging at his sides, staring straight at the road. It startled me. People don't just stand in the desert at 2 in the morning. I slowed down instinctively, leaning forward to get a better look. His clothes looked dirty, torn in places. His skin was pale under the moonlight. And even though his eyes were shadowed by the brim of his cap, I could feel them following me as I passed. I drove on, glancing back in the mirrors. He was gone. Not walking away. Not receding into the distance. Just, gone. I know how that sounds. Like I missed him, like he stepped into the darkness. But I swear to you there was nowhere for him to go. Flat desert on both sides. No bushes. No trees. Just emptiness. And yet, the man I'd seen seconds before wasn't there anymore. I tried to shake it off. People wander highways sometimes. Maybe he had a car parked just out of sight. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But about 10 minutes later, my radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched it, it had been turned off since I left Amarillo. Yet suddenly, it burst with static, loud and violent, making me jump. I reached out to switch it off, but before I could, the static cleared for half a second. And I heard something underneath. A voice. It was faint, broken by the static, but unmistakably a man's voice. It said just one thing. Don't stop. The words were gone as quickly as they came. Static swallowed the signal again, and then the radio went silent. I stared at it for a long time before switching it off completely. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, but I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to keep moving to get as far from mile marker 313 as possible. 15 minutes later, I saw him again. Same man. Same plaid shirt. Same baseball cap. Only this time, he was standing on the opposite side of the road. I felt my chest tighten. There was no way. I'd been driving 70 miles per hour since I passed him the first time. Even if he'd had a car and he hadn't, there was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. But there he was. And this time, as I approached, he raised one arm and pointed straight at me. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a plea for help. It was deliberate, almost accusatory, a single, slow point, following me as I sped past. I drove faster. My hands were slick on the wheel. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. All I knew was that something was very, very wrong. The next half hour was a blur. The radio stayed silent. The road stretched endlessly ahead. My GPS lost signal. The temperature dropped 10 degrees inside the cab, even though the heater was blasting. And every few miles, I caught glimpses of movement in the periphery of my headlights, shapes darting away into the desert, just beyond the reach of light. And then I saw him again. Mile marker 313. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Maybe I'd read the number wrong the first time. But no, I knew I'd passed it already. I'd driven nearly 40 miles since then. There was no way I was back where I started. Yet there it was. The battered green sign. The same crack in the asphalt I remembered. And standing beside it, the man. Only now, he was closer to the road. His head was tilted at a strange angle, like his neck couldn't quite support it. And even though I was still several hundred feet away, I swear I could see his mouth moving. He was saying something. Over and over. I pressed harder on the gas, my mind screaming that none of this was possible. I should have reached the next town by now. I should have seen a rest stop. Something. Anything. But the highway stretched on, endless and empty. And then the truck shuddered hard. The engine coughed and died. My headlights flickered and went out. The power steering failed. I coasted to a stop right beside mile marker 313. The night swallowed me whole. The silence was total. No wind. No engine. No distant hum of tires on asphalt. Just darkness, cold and absolute. And then, somewhere behind me, a tap. Soft. Deliberate. Like knuckles against metal. I froze. My hand hovered over the door lock. Another tap. Closer this time. Then another, on the other side. Something or someone was circling the truck. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. Dead. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. It was as if every piece of electronics in the cab had simply died. The tapping stopped. And then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, approaching slowly from behind. I stared into the mirrors, but they reflected nothing but blackness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right beside my door. Silence. And then, a voice low, rasping, barely more than a whisper. Get out. It was the same voice I'd heard on the radio. I don't know how long I sat there, gripping the wheels so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the voice stopped. The night fell silent again. And then, the engine roared back to life. The headlights flicked on. The radio came alive with static. My phone buzzed back to life on the seat beside me. Everything that had died was suddenly working again, as if nothing had happened. I floored it. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as I sped down the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove until the first sign of civilization appeared, a gas station near Winslow, and I pulled in, shaking so hard I could barely turn off the engine. I went inside and asked the clerk if there was a town near mile marker 313. He frowned and said there wasn't. Just desert. He asked why I was asking, and I told him, or tried to. As I described the man, the voice, the engine dying, his face went pale. He told me that about 15 years ago, there had been someone at mile marker 313. A hitchhiker. A man in a plaid shirt and a baseball cap. He'd been walking along the highway one night when a passing truck struck him. The driver panicked and fled. The man lay there on the shoulder for nearly 2 days before anyone found him. By then, it was too late. The truck driver was never caught. But ever since then, people had reported seeing a man standing by mile marker 313 late at night. Always the same description. Always the same silence. And always, the same warning. Don't stop. I never drove that route again. Even now, years later, I think about that night. About the way the road seemed to fold in on itself, trapping me in a loop. About the man pointing at me from the darkness. About the whisper that wanted me to step out of the cab. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone on some forgotten stretch of highway, I glance at the mile markers. And when I see 313, I press the gas a little harder. Because some roads remember. And some spirits never stop waiting. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget: the highway is more than just asphalt and paint. It remembers. It holds echoes of the past accidents, tragedies, moments of fear and pain, and sometimes, those echoes don't fade. They wait for someone like me to pass by in the dark. If you ever find yourself driving late at night and your radio whispers words you shouldn't hear, don't stop. And finally, we end with a story that's as real as it is terrifying. No ghosts. No legends. Just a quiet stretch of road, a lone driver, and a stranger with intentions far darker than anyone could imagine. Story 3: The Man in the Rear View. Not every terrifying thing that happens on the road is supernatural. Sometimes, the real danger wears a human face. And sometimes, the scariest part of a late-night drive isn't what appears in front of you, but what's already behind you. This is one of those late-night driving scary stories I'll never forget. Because unlike ghosts or legends, this one could happen to anyone, even you. I used to work late-night shifts at a distribution warehouse outside Albuquerque. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid well, and I liked the quiet hours. My routine was simple: finish work around 1 a.m., grab a coffee, and make the hour-long drive back home along Highway 285. That road was always empty at that hour. Long, straight stretches of desert highway, no lights, no towns, just endless darkness and the hum of the tires beneath me. I'd driven it hundreds of times without incident. But one night, that drive almost ended very differently. It was early December, cold enough that my breath fogged in the car. My shift had run late, and by the time I clocked out it was nearly 2:30 a.m. The lot was nearly empty, the building dark behind me as I climbed into my old silver sedan. I remember being tired but in a good mood. I had the next 2 days off, and I was already thinking about sleeping in. The highway was deserted, as usual. The sky was cloudless and moonless, a black void stretching forever. I put on some music and settled into that half-hypnotic state you get during long night drives, where your body knows what to do and your mind drifts. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights in my rear-view mirror. Nothing unusual except they were far back, and they weren't gaining on me. They just stayed there. A good quarter-mile behind, perfectly centered in the lane, neither closing the distance nor falling back. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe another late shift worker heading home. But 10 minutes passed. Then 20. And those headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind me. It started to feel deliberate. I tried speeding up. The headlights sped up too, maintaining the same gap. I slowed down. They slowed down. Every time I changed my speed, they mirrored it. That's when the unease started creeping in. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were half asleep and matching my pace without thinking. But another part of me, the part that had watched too many crime documentaries, started running through worst-case scenarios. Another 15 minutes passed. We were the only 2 cars on that endless stretch of desert road. The highway was so flat and empty that I could see for miles in every direction, and yet, nothing. No exits. No gas stations. No places to pull over. Just darkness and those damn headlights, always there, always the same distance behind me. I turned off the music. The silence in the car felt heavier now. Every so often, I glanced into the mirror and every time, they were still there. Then, something changed. The headlights began to drift closer. Slowly, steadily, closing the gap they had held for nearly an hour. I watched as they grew larger, brighter. Whoever was behind me was finally moving faster. I felt my heart start to pound. They crept closer, and closer, until they were just 2 car lengths behind me. Close enough that I could make out the shape of the vehicle, an old, dark pickup truck. No front license plate. The driver's silhouette was impossible to see through the glare of their own headlights. I tapped the brakes lightly, just to test their reaction. They braked too immediately, precisely. Then they accelerated again, closing the distance until they were tailgating me. The road stretched on ahead, empty and straight, but I suddenly felt trapped. I tried changing lanes. They followed. I switched back. So did they. That was when I realized it wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was behind me was doing it on purpose. I reached for my phone, thinking I'd call the police, but of course, there was no signal out there. There never was. I was 40 miles from the next town in either direction. If I stopped, I'd be completely alone. The pickup's headlights flared brighter. They were getting closer. Too close. I felt the urge to slam the gas pedal and outrun them, but a stretch of sharp turns was coming up ahead, and I didn't want to risk losing control. I told myself to stay calm. Keep driving. Don't let them scare you. But then, they turned off their headlights. Just like that. Total darkness behind me. I stared into the rear-view mirror, heart thudding, but I couldn't see anything. No truck, no lights, nothing. Just blackness stretching behind me. And yet, I knew they were still there. I could feel it. A sixth sense, prickling at the back of my neck. My gut screamed that they were right behind me, matching my speed, close enough to touch my bumper. I flicked my high beams on and off, hoping they'd respond. Nothing. For 10 long minutes, I drove through the darkness, blind to what was behind me. Every muscle in my body was tense. Every nerve screamed to look, to know, but the mirrors showed nothing. And then the lights snapped back on. They were right behind me. Closer than ever. Maybe 6 feet from my rear bumper. Too close for safety. Too close for accident. Whoever was driving was playing with me now. I accelerated. 70, 80. 90. The pickup stayed glued to me, never falling back, never pulling ahead. Just there, like a predator stalking prey. My mind raced through options. No signal. No nearby exits. No traffic. I was on my own. Then I remembered something, a rest area about 20 miles ahead. It wasn't much, just a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom, but it was something. Maybe there'd be another driver there. Maybe lights. Maybe safety. I pressed harder on the gas and fixed my eyes on the road, counting down the miles. 19. 18. 17. The truck's headlights vanished again. This time, they didn't come back. The road behind me was empty. My mirrors showed nothing. I craned my neck, searching the darkness. Had they turned off? Fallen back? I scanned the horizon. Nothing. I drove another mile. Then 2. Then 5. Still nothing. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. I told myself it was over. Maybe they'd gotten bored. Maybe they'd pulled off somewhere. I laughed nervously at how shaken I'd gotten over nothing. And then I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft thump from the rear of the car. Then another. Louder. Rhythmic. Like someone knocking, from the trunk. I froze. No. It wasn't possible. I hadn't stopped. No one could have gotten into my car. But the sound came again. Thump. 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 I gripped the wheel tighter, my mind racing. Maybe something had shifted in the trunk. Maybe a box was bouncing. That had to be it. I was overreacting. But then the sound changed. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was a scrape. Slow. Deliberate. Metal against metal. And it was moving from the back of the car toward the rear seats. And then, the faintest sound of breathing. Shallow. Ragged. Coming from inside the car. I almost swerved off the road. My brain refused to process it. It was impossible. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't let anyone in. But the breathing was real. Close. Too close. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for the switch to turn on the interior lights. My hand trembled. I flipped the switch. The back seat was empty. But the trunk. The sound was definitely coming from the trunk. I considered pulling over, but the thought of stepping out into the darkness with whoever might be back there paralyzed me. If I stopped, I'd be exposed. Vulnerable. If I kept going, maybe I could make it to that rest stop and call for help. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back. Every minute felt like an hour. The scraping continued, louder now, as if whoever or whatever was back there was trying to force their way through. I locked the doors, even though I knew it wouldn't matter if they were inside already. Finally I saw the glow of sodium lights ahead. The rest area. I pulled in fast, skidding slightly as I came to a stop under one of the lamps. The moment I parked, the noises stopped. Silence. I climbed out of the car on shaking legs and dialed 911. This time, I had a signal. My voice trembled as I explained what had happened. They told me to stay put and that a patrol unit was on its way. It took them 20 minutes to arrive. Longest 20 minutes of my life. When the officer got there, I handed him my keys and told him to check the trunk. He approached cautiously, hand on his gun, and popped it open. It was empty. No one inside. Nothing disturbed. Just the spare tire and my emergency kit. I must have looked like I was losing my mind, because the officer put a hand on my shoulder and told me to take a deep breath. "Are you sure you heard something?" he asked gently. I swore I had. The knocking. The scraping. The breathing. It had been real. It had to be. The officer nodded slowly. "You're not the first person to report something like this around here," he said. "There's been a string of incidents along this highway. Someone's been targeting drivers late at night. Following them. Harassing them. Sometimes trying to run them off the road." He told me that 2 weeks earlier, a man driving home from a night shift had stopped to help what he thought was a stranded motorist. The person attacked him and tried to steal his car. Another driver reported being chased for miles by a pickup truck that disappeared without a trace. "We haven't caught them yet," the officer said. "But they like to play with people first. Scare them. Test how they react." I felt sick. Whoever had been following me, whoever had turned off their lights and toyed with me for nearly an hour, hadn't just been trying to scare me. They'd been hunting. The officer followed me as I drove the remaining miles home. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. Every sound made me jump. Every passing set of headlights made my heart race. And even now, years later, I still can't drive that stretch of road without glancing into my rearview mirror every few seconds. Because I know that somewhere out there, someone is still doing it. Waiting for the next driver to follow. Waiting for the next person to play with. And maybe next time, they won't stop at just following. The scariest thing about this story isn't that it happened, it's that it could happen again. Late night roads are lonely places, far from help and full of shadows. And while ghost stories are frightening, sometimes the most dangerous thing out there is another person with bad intentions and too much time on their hands. So the next time you're driving late at night and notice the same pair of headlights behind you, keep an eye on your mirror. Because not every story ends with you getting home. If you've ever driven a lonely road in the middle of the night, you know the feeling, that quiet unease that settles in, mile after mile, as the darkness seems to press closer and closer. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the mind playing tricks. But then again, maybe not. Thank you for listening to these late-night driving scary stories. If you enjoyed them, consider subscribing and sharing this video. It helps more than you know. And remember, the next time you find yourself alone on a dark highway, keep your eyes on the road, and your doors locked. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones still out there, waiting for you.